You know, Disney, when Ursula said, the only way to get what you want is to become human yourself, this was not what she meant.
Look at her stupid little feet!
Hey there, folks. I'd say this is something I need to get off my chest, but I kind of have before. A long time ago, back in these days, I went off on how much I hate the entire notion of the Disney live action remakes of their animated properties. I had hoped at the time that they would not prove to be continually successful and they would stop. It's been a fair few years since then. That has not happened. I don't really want to reiterate the points I made in my original video, even though I have way more subscribers since that happened, largely because those points haven't changed. But obviously, those points, no matter how valid I feel they were and still are, they didn't dissuade Disney from continuing to make them and from a shockingly large portion of the audience continuing to go and see them. So, I mean, if you want the short overview, I just kind of find it a little bit artistically, let's go with frustrating at best and offensive at worst. I had at the time a lot of concern that this would somehow supplant the original animated feature. That I really don't think has actually proven to be the case as we've gone further out. I still find it kind of inherently disrespectful, and it kind of, whether intended or not, reinforces the idea that only live action are real movies. But obviously, this is still happening, and the animated ones have not been as fully supplanted. Like, I couldn't name you a single one of these that I have ever heard anybody make the case this is somehow better than the original. I'm not saying that nobody thinks that. I certainly haven't encountered anybody who does, even among the people who like these things. But I still kind of want to vent my frustration about the fact that they are still happening, and also kind of acknowledge that I think I have a better understanding of why they are continuing to be successful. Not why is Disney continuing to make them. The answer is money. Shock of shocks. What has surprised me is the fact that they continue to succeed to the extent that they do. It's kind of taken the infection spreading to other studios, as we are now going to be getting a live action remake of How to Train Your Dragon from DreamWorks, that I've really had to grapple with, okay, why are these things actually being successful? Even though I think as time goes on, none of them will be remembered to the degree that the originals were in literally any of these cases. I mean, maybe if Disney ever remakes The Black Cauldron, maybe that'll be better remembered than the original, but that's just because the original was such a freaking failure. But so far what we've gotten, that hasn't happened, and I don't think it ever will, really. But I do think I have a better handle on why these succeed. And I will get to that, but in true video essay or pseudo video essay or whatever it is you consider that I do, I'm going to oscillate around the point a little bit, because I kind of want to talk about why this even happens. And again, like, not the motivation. The motivation is money. Yeah, no kidding. But it is actually a very natural evolution of what Disney has been doing since very, very early in its history. And I kind of want to go over that evolution too, because I do think in some ways that informs what's currently going on, and also partly why it's successful. So let's do a little bit of history. How did we even get here? Well, the thing is, Disney has always had two primary ways to reliably make money. Like, they would always want their new projects to succeed, but they had two ways to consistently make money that would help cushion even some failures of some other stuff. One, the parks. The parks were always pretty successful. But two, reissues of their existing catalog. Finding ways to make more money off the stuff they already made is actually a pretty sizable part of Disney's business model. It has been for a very long time. I couldn't tell you exactly when it started. I don't even think it was specifically Disney. It actually was a more common practice long time ago for older movies to be reissued into theaters, especially if there wasn't really anything new to show. This is partly how movies like Gone with the Wind became all-time box office successes if you adjust for inflation, because not all that money was made on its initial run. They kept being put back in theaters in the years that followed. And Disney did this a lot. Heck, that's why Fantasia was eventually financially successful, because when that thing was first released, it bombed. But through reissues, they were eventually able to make money. Now, as I said, I couldn't pin you down a year on exactly when this started or how prevalent it was, but I can tell you from my own personal experience, it continued at least into the 80s, because I remember going into a movie theater and seeing Peter Pan, 101 Dalmatians, and Songs of the Goddamn South. Even in the 80s, they were not yet ashamed of that movie. I saw it in a theater. Yeah, that's kind of funny to think about now. And of course, the initial launch of the Disney Channel, which, keep in mind, started out as a premium cable channel with no ads, it had a pretty limited amount of original programming, and what most of it was just re-airings of stuff it had, whether it was the various shorts. I remember they would do like a half-hour block of like just Donald cartoons, or just Mickey cartoons, or just Goofy cartoons, etc., etc. But they'd also show their old classic movies. And again, that was sort of the main selling point for that as a premium channel at the time. And then, starting in the 80s, they took the next evolution, because home video blew up in the 80s, thanks to VHS. And Disney initially was pretty reluctant to get on that bandwagon. I think there was a fear of actually sort of weakening the brand if people could just watch it at home anytime. Well, they're not going to go to the theater and see our reissues anymore. Well, no, that's kind of true. But like that trepidation is why the first one released to VHS was Pinocchio. Considered a classic now, at the time, people liked it fine, but it wasn't considered an all-time classic. But it was the first one they released to VHS. You'd think the first one they do would be Snow White. That'd be the natural fit, the very first movie they ever did. But no, it started with Pinocchio. And then that sold massively. And then you started getting more releases from Disney on VHS. Now, they still wanted a sense of exclusivity. If you're my age, you might remember the entire marketing tool of the Disney Vault. Whenever they would release one of these older films.
So before they go back into the Disney Vault for years to come, hurry.
Ooh, be sure to get it now before it goes back in the Disney Vault. The idea was that these were only going to be available for a limited amount of time. And this was also at the same time that the re-releases to theaters were tapering off. So they basically replaced what had been the steady stream of income from re-releasing into theaters with the VHS releases. And while those were incredibly successful, there is a hitch, because you can only sell a home video version of a thing once. Now, as time would go on, it would prove later, okay, we can get them to upgrade to better formats, to DVD, maybe to Blu-ray, but like at this point, they've introduced better formats, 4K and whatnot, but like those have never taken off the way VHS and DVD did. I mean, even Blu-ray has done significantly fewer sales than DVD and VHS, because the upgrade from DVD to Blu-ray, it's noticeable, but it's not a big enough jump for everybody to want to rebuy the same thing. But of course, that would be a bit down the line. As far as initially in the 80s and the early 90s, well, okay, we can sell them these home video versions, but we can only do it once. So once we've sold it to them, and we can't really reissue it in the theaters again, at least not if we have issued it on VHS, what can we do? Well, that brought the next evolution, which was naturally direct-to-video sequels. Now, that was something that would turn out to be a little bit of a monkey's paw deal, because yes, those would actually prove to be quite good financial returns for them, partially because they spent way less money on those than they did on their theatrical films. But the thing is, that also meant that they just were worse. They, like, across the board. Even if they got the original voice actors back, which they didn't always, but even if they did, the visual quality was going to be worse. The color palette was going to be muddied. If there were songs, they probably weren't going to be as good. They just were lesser quality products. And yeah, young kids would still be like, I want to watch more Aladdin. And yeah, they'd go for that, or, you know, Belle's Magical Christmas or whatever else. But that was ultimately kind of doing that dilution of the quality of the brand over time as it went on. And the thing is, they even kind of eventually found a way around some of these problems. By the time the third Little Mermaid movie came out, they'd actually gotten to a point where, on a much smaller budget, they could create visuals that were significantly closer to that original release than, like, the first Little Mermaid sequel, which just looks way worse. But by then it didn't matter. Like, the dilution had already happened, and they couldn't really claw back from that. And clearly Disney understood that, because that one time that they accidentally made a really good sequel and they knew how good it was, they released it to theaters instead of direct to VHS like the original plan. That being Toy Story 2. Yeah, that was going to be direct to video. But they realized how good it was. Like, no, it would be wasted on that market, because something this good deserves a bigger audience. Thank goodness they realized that at the time. But the fact that they realized it was kind of a soft admission that the home video releases were trash. And they knew that they were trash. So, okay, you can't really get away with re-releasing to theaters too often. Like, maybe on occasion, like on a big anniversary, you can re-release it. Or maybe when 3D gimmickry was a thing, you can re-release it in 3D. But you can't do it as steadily as you used to be able to. You've already sold people their home video versions. We're getting into the 2000s, so they've upgraded to DVD. Not as many people are going to end up upgrading to Blu-ray later on. Because of dilution, people don't really like the sequel, so those have been diminishing returns, and probably is something that you should stop doing. So now what are the choices to continue to get recurrent revenue off of the things you already made? Something that's been a big part of your business, and or at least a steady part of your business for ever. How do you keep making more money off something that already exists? Well, enter the live action remake. Now, in terms of an initial investment, these were by their nature riskier than doing the very cheap made-for-video sequels, or certainly than the re-releases, but it did still mean that they could bank on the existing love of something they knew was already successful. So they were still taking out the risk of having to come up with a whole new thing. So that is a massive risk, especially as we got more and more and more into the eras of franchising and just recognizable brands, and like, we don't let things ever just die. And so new stuff became riskier. Let's just do what we've already done. We'll remake it. Now, most of what I'm going to be talking about is the era that kicked off in, I think, around 2010, around there, late 2000s, early 2010s. But technically, Disney live action remakes predate that. But they didn't kick off a trend, because there were two initially. There was The Jungle Book, which nobody even remembers that was a Disney joint, and it wasn't necessarily immediately identifiable as a remake of the original Disney film. And then there was 101 Dalmatians, which was immediately identifiable as a remake of the Disney film. And that one got anchored by a very memorable performance from Glenn Close. And that was also pretty dang successful. While The Jungle Book did make its money back, it didn't really make any kind of a splash and didn't really seem like it was something worth continuing. 101 Dalmatians made back nearly 5 times its budget and spawned a sequel, which made a little back more than double its budget. Still would make it profitable, but I suspect Disney saw the diminishing returns and decided, like, let's not overcook this the way we did with the direct-to-video sequels, and they just didn't keep doing it after that. I think they kind of assumed at the time that the success of 101 Dalmatians might have been a fluke, and they didn't want to keep banking on it. So there wouldn't really be another live-action version of a classic until Alice in Wonderland in 2010. Now, although Alice in Wonderland was a big hit and brought over $1 billion at the box office, you can kind of tell Disney wasn't really fully expecting how well it was going to do and wasn't necessarily immediately prepared to bank further off of its success. They didn't really know how to capitalize it, and there wouldn't be another live-action cash-in for another 4 years after that. And also, the other weird thing to remember about Alice in Wonderland is that it's not technically a remake. Despite sharing the exact same title, it's actually a sort of a stealth sequel, but it's one that primarily repeats the beats that people know from the original. So it was an approach that was not quite a straight up remake. So Disney looked at it and went, okay, that was successful, but it was difficult to know what elements made it successful. Did people want straight up remakes? Was it the fact that it wasn't exactly straight up a remake and was something a little bit different? Was that a selling point, or did that hold it back from the success that it could have seen? Was the presence of Tim Burton, because Tim Burton and Alice in Wonderland, yeah, no brainer, how much of that was an impact? And if they can't pair up a kind of iconic director that is going to bring in, people with brand loyalty to them, because Tim Burton is one of the few directors who kind of has that, or at least he did at the time. Can they actually repeat this? And which again, I think is why you didn't see them try again for a little bit. I really do think it caught them off guard. Because as much as Alice in Wonderland proved that cashing in on the name in a live action version was absolutely viable and profitable, Disney didn't seem too sure about whether people wanted the diversions or the loyalty. Hence, the next one out the door was Maleficent. That was followed by Cinderella, a distinctly different spin, followed by a more loyal retelling, though no longer a musical and less whimsy overall. So you look at something like Maleficent and Cinderella, and it's almost like they're just trying different mixes. They were like, okay, here's something that is kind of a remake because we're not claiming it's a sequel and it is retelling the events within it, and we're even going to recreate some scenes, but it is also doing a lot of other stuff. And then here's Cinderella, which is pretty much just telling that same story, but we're not doing a one-to-one with all that many elements. Let's see how these do. The Jungle Book was next, and unlike its 90s remake, that one did retain not only the fact that it was a musical, but the exact same songs. That was, for me personally, the point at which I bailed on this entire exercise. I went, nope, you're not even trying, because trust me, there is plenty of room to just readapt the Jungle Book. There was a lot they didn't use or took in a direction that isn't quite representative from the original work. For better or worse, you can make your own call on that, but you could totally do something different, and in a way they kind of already did with the 90s, but they probably looked at that and went, okay, that didn't do that much. Let's keep the musical aspect. Same songs even. That was the point at which I gave up on the whole exercise. Was like, this is devoid of artistic merit. I hadn't fully given up prior to that because Maleficent at least is a distinctly different product from Sleeping Beauty. Whether you like it or not, it is definitely doing its own thing. And whether or not you like that movie, I think it's a third of a great movie. And the third act is okay. The middle's a mess, but certainly had a lot more artistic merit. And I was like, okay, maybe something good could come out of this. But then by Jungle Book, I gave up. Same year as the Jungle Book, we also got Pete's Dragon, but I'm not going to dwell on that because as much as it is very much doing its own thing, and I would applaud it, that the thing is Pete's Dragon was not a well-remembered movie. So I don't think the idea of doing a one-to-one would have ever been on the table. That one's kind of an outlier because the original wasn't even that beloved. It also wasn't super successful, so I think the Jungle Book was the way more relevant one from that year. But after the Jungle Book, all the disparate pieces fully came together with Beauty and the Beast, which is the same story beat for beat, contains the same characters with the same names, the same musical numbers. It's just the same thing, but longer and worse. But it was the first one of these to crack $1 billion since Alice. So at that point, Disney locked it in as the primary formula. And since then, following that formula, we've had Aladdin, The Lion King, Lady and the Tramp, Pinocchio, and The Little Mermaid, all more or less straight up remaking their own works, While upcoming, we've got Lilo and Stitch, Moana, and Snow White, all with release dates in the next 2 years, and announced plans for Hercules, Bambi, the Aristocats, Tangled, and Robin Hood. I guess they feel like inspiring a whole new generation of furries with that one. The main notable deviations from the Beauty and the Beast formula since it came out were Mulan and Dumbo. Also, possibly Lady and the Tramp. Honestly, I know almost nothing about that one because it went direct to streaming and I don't know anybody who saw it. But in regards to Mulan and Dumbo, they both stripped out the musical numbers, which isn't really a thing that they seem to want to do anymore. But it's worth noting, both of those entered development before Beauty and the Beast came out, and I suspect we're too far along in development to fully retool to that extent by the time Beauty and the Beast came out and Disney realized, oh, we should be doing more just straight up remakes of as many elements as we can get away with. The other major deviation was Cruella, which I have to wonder how much of that was because Disney had already done the straight up remake in the 90s, and at least some people still remember that, and remaking a remake might have been a little too gauche even for them. I mean, yeah, sure, technically they did it with the Jungle Book, but like nobody remembered that from the 90s. People did still remember 101 Dalmatians, if only for Glenn Close. So Cruella seemed to be modeled a bit more off Maleficent, at least in terms of overall structure and approach, but other than that, they've really locked in on this whole notion of like, just redo it. Just redo it. I suppose some of you are waiting for me to bring up Mufasa, which does technically do some deviations, but yeah, that hasn't really worked out. We'll come back to that though. But this is the course that Disney's taking, and it's got one very clear problem with it. Eventually, they're just going to straight up run out of stuff to remake. That's actually kind of already starting to bite them in the butt because, like I said, we've got Moana coming out. By the time that comes out, the original will only be 10 years old. That's not just like, boy, seems too soon. I think there's going to be an active problem for them. But again, hold on to that thought. We'll get there. But that brings me back to why I started. Why are these still successful? Disney found a formula and they're sticking to it. Why does the formula work, though? As I already said, I can't think of a single instance where these are viewed as improvements on the original. And by this point, I think the older remakes are already starting to fade from memory. And about the best they manage are the novelty ones like Cruella and Maleficent. And I mentioned Mufasa. Well, it doesn't really look like sequels and or prequels to these live action remakes are going to be the way to go either. The Maleficent sequel made about 2/3 of what the first one did, and the Lion King prequel is unlikely to pull in half of what the first one did. Now, both of these were still profitable, don't get me wrong, but it's that diminishing returns thing again. It's the same thing that I suspect spooked Disney off of the live action remakes after they did the 101 Dalmatians live action sequel. It was successful, but it was a notable drop from before, which meant that wasn't a well they should keep going back to. And I think they've now already seen that with the idea of sequels or prequels because Maleficent and Mufasa, pretty significant drops from their previous films. And we are in an age where sequels often make more money than what came before. So if you drop by a bit, something isn't working. Clearly, there is way less interest in these remakes being built out into new franchises than just the initial pitch of remaking the classic. But again, why were the initial remakes successful? I think ultimately the success of these is driven primarily by what I'm going to refer to as Disney parents. I want to specify this isn't quite the same thing as sort of the classic Disney adult. This is a little bit more specific than that. These people may or may not actually be sort of Disney adults, i.e. people who have never really grown out of Disney and continue to enjoy it and never really left it behind as a kid's thing. Disney parents may or may not be that, but they did grow up on Disney and now they've got kids of their own. I actually think this notion of Disney parents is a broader category than Disney adults, and it doesn't require the same level of hardcore devotion to the brand that Disney adults tend to exhibit. As I said, these are people who grew up with the Disney movies, probably have a lot of positive memories about them, and the result is a live-action remake isn't just selling them the same movie again, it's selling them the promise of reliving something close to watching a movie they grew up on for the first time, and also they get to share that experience with their kids. Yeah, sure, you could take your kids to a new children's movie, and maybe it'll even be great. But this has the added selling point of, you already know you love it. Don't you want to try and recapture that? I actually fully formed this notion upon the release of the trailer for not a Disney product, but the aforementioned How to Train Your Dragon. Because as much as I have written off the Disney remakes at this point, I felt a visceral sickness at seeing that trailer. Because not only did they bring back the same director, depriving us of whatever new things he might be doing, but they are bringing back the same actor to play Stoic. The design of all the dragons is exactly the same. All they've done is try to make the textures a bit more ultra realistic. They are recreating exact shots from the original. You can see it in the trailer, and they've got the same music, which again, for me, is kind of a kicker. And look, I love that soundtrack. I adore the How to Train Your Dragon soundtrack. It is one of my all-time favorites. But you really show how artistically devoid of merit your remake is when you can't even think that you'd come up with decent music that people would want to hear instead of the original. You're kind of just proving that what people want is the original when you are recycling this many elements. But the thing is, when I looked into the reaction to that trailer, nobody else seemed to feel this way. None of the folks who were commenting on it or about it. And when I actually drilled down and looked at those comments, actually tried to engage with them, realizing that at the time that the original How to Train Your Dragon came out is probably just long enough for some of these people to either have had their own kids or to be thinking about getting close to that point. And I saw so many people get so excited at the idea of going and recapturing that, reliving that. And as cynical as it is to appeal to that, I also can't fully fault it. I need to be honest with myself and admit to the fact that one of my favorite movie-going experiences I ever had was going to see Peter Jackson's King Kong. I grew up on the original King Kong. I knew it by heart. And there was something really unique, something really exciting, a very childlike thrill that I felt going to see the new King Kong in the theater. The 8-year-old in me was ecstatic. And I still remember that feeling. Now, was it the best movie that came out that year? No. Is it an exceptionally amazing movie? I think it's better than a lot of people consider it. It's too long, but I still think it's really good, but it was the best movie-going experience I had that year, and is still to this day one of the most memorable ones I've had, because it did capture that for me. Now, I'm clearly too jaded on the artistically bereft nature of these animation to live action remakes for these to work for me. Too many recycled elements. Whatever you think about the Peter Jackson King Kong, he definitely did his own thing with it for all of the stuff that was directly lifted from the original. But that's just not what's going on with these live action remakes. But if that doesn't bother you, they are selling you that sensation that, again, I need to admit I felt and liked when I did feel it. I think the mistake I made in my assessment of these things and thinking that they would fail was that I was looking at them strictly through the lens of their artistic merit and seeing there wasn't much. And once they locked in the Beauty and the Beast model of just stick as close as possible, then I really saw no artistic merit. But artistic merit isn't, well, it's definitely not why these things are being made or ever were, but it's also not why most audiences go to them. It helps to remember sometimes that whatever you think about a thing, you're just you, and you may well be the exception. So I don't think, when it comes to entertainment taste, I don't think it's of any merit to get annoyed at people for liking a thing you don't or not liking a thing you do. I know that might seem weird coming from me, given some of the videos that I've made over the years, but I do try to vent my frustrations at the work itself and not the audience that does or doesn't like it. I sometimes do touch on that stuff, but I try not to dwell on it because if I do or don't like a thing, I want it to be about the thing. But because these remakes aren't trying to find some new artistic vision and they're just trying to recapture something, the best way to do that is just having something that is going to be recognized by these Disney parents or DreamWorks parents now, too, I suppose, who will get excited for themselves, but also to bring their families. Family audiences, like the reason kids' movies tend to do very well if they don't bomb is because it's not just like kids coming to see it. It's parents bringing their kids, sometimes parents bringing multiple kids, sometimes both parents going. You tend to sell more tickets just by the nature of the beast. This all does kind of work. As much as the cynic in me wants to say there's no artistic merit, let it die, I need to remember that experience I had watching King Kong. That's what people are chasing. Now, the Disney remakes don't do that for me. They never have, and I don't think they ever will. But I have had a movie do that to me at least once. So as much as these things annoy me by their very existence, they at least don't appear to be supplanting the originals as time goes on. And I do have to admit, much to my chagrin, at this point, I kind of get it. But as I said, it's a finite resource. I'm going to be keeping a real close eye on how the Moana remake does because it can't quite work the same way that the Beauty and the Beast remake did. Because by the time the Beauty and the Beast remake came out, the people who grew up on that original movies had kids. With this, though, it's only been 10 years by the time it comes out. The original audience for Moana hasn't had time to have kids. Most of them probably haven't even had time to even think about kids. So I can't imagine it's going to pull in the same audience. It might actually arguably be the case for How to Train Your Dragon as well. That might be coming out too soon, but that at least has a little bit more distance than Moana does. And even setting the issue of whether or not the original audience is old enough to have kids aside, are they even old enough to have that kind of nostalgia? Like, I'm not going to say you don't have some degree of nostalgia if you're in your 20s, but like, it's nowhere near the kind of thing that you feel when you're in your 30s and 40s. And people in their 30s and 40s, yeah, you can milk money out of that nostalgia. I don't know if it's strong enough when you're in your 20s. I mean, maybe, but I'd be surprised, at least in the same kind of numbers. And that's not even getting into the fact that we just had Moana 2. So it's not like the original went away. And also, and I do find myself wondering the same thing about the DreamWorks and How to Train Your Dragon thing. What if it is successful? Do you make a Moana 2 remake? Do you make a How to Train Your Dragon 2 remake? If you don't, what else can you do? Because, as I said, Mufasa doing a prequel, which was very decidedly not a remake of any of the Lion King sequel material that came out, didn't do nearly as well. Even if the Moana remake does succeed, it's still a finite resource. They're going to burn through all of it eventually. But I do get how we got here. I do finally understand why it's worked, much to my continued frustration. And as far as Moana goes, let me just put it on the record. I expect a decent opening weekend for the novelty, a pretty big drop-off, $500 million tops, enough to be profitable, but nowhere near the likes of Beauty and the Beast, Aladdin, Jungle Book, or the Lion King remakes. And we'll see if that'll be enough for Disney to, I don't know, figure out something else to do. I mean, they are also doing sequels, like proper theatrical sequels to some of their big hits, but that is more work than a remake, because you do still have to sell audiences on the idea of coming back and seeing a new thing with these characters. We have gotten, obviously Pixar's done a lot of sequels, but we've gotten Frozen 2. We're probably going to get a Tangled 2. They've been talking about that for a while. We're getting Zootopia 2. There'll probably be more, but that is more work than just a remake. There's a little bit more uncertainty. Not as much as a completely original piece. That would have the least certainty. And that seems to be what they are avoiding as much as they possibly can. Because, you know, Disney Animation's last fully original thing, I think it was their last one, Strange World, boy did that tank. I would argue largely because they barely marketed the damn thing. But that's a whole other conversation. But yeah, I kind of get it now. I still don't like it though. Disney remakes, how we got here, why they are successful, and why, by their nature, they can't go on indefinitely. I think Disney knows that, and that's why they're continuing to milk actual straight-up sequels, but even then, eventually, they're going to have to try and do original stuff again. But I don't know if they'll ever have the faith in their original products to give us a run of original films like we got during the Disney Renaissance in the 90s. Or even the string of stuff we got in the 2000s to early 2010s. But that's my cynical ass thoughts on it. What do you think about all this? Do you like these remakes? Even if you do, have you ever liked them better than the originals? Do you rewatch them with anything close to the same frequency that you rewatch the originals? Whatever your thoughts are on any of this, drop something down in the comments and let's talk about it. Patreon pays the bills, enables me to do this as my living, even if you can't help me out that way. Like, share, subscribe, YouTube stuff. You know what it is. It all helps, but don't worry too much about it. What I really want you to remember, whether you look forward to these things or you dread them, you are beautiful, you are valid, and you are loved. You are the council. I'm just running the meetings. And until next time, this council is adjourned. And now to thank my highest supporting patrons: Robin Moore, Goddess Elida, Zubin Lopfula, Welsh Wrestling Geeks, Alistair McPherson, Oliver B., Melissa Pedersen, Movie Turtle, Ulrich Bogdan, Loki Eris, Melinda Walters, Auntie Kate 808, Becky Sparks, Fernabi Likes the Poodle, Tracy Scrabbit, Angry Casperl, Dave Hall, White Bearish, Rosalind Bennett, Adam R.D.L. Taylor, Pal Barabajoggle, Mira G, and Sir Didymus is my favorite. If you'd like me to... I read the names fine, then screwed it up. If you would like to hear me try and say your name while these guys chitter in my ears, check out the rewards on my Patreon. Yeah, you're not distracting at all.